Hello, everyone, and welcome to our online Advent Bible study. Now, this was just a short study, kind of experimental, and this will be our last video for our Psalm study because Advent is almost over. Next week is Christmas Eve, and I'm considering doing something after the holidays and after the New Year. So, if you enjoyed this and you want to dive deeper into another book of the Bible, let me know. Maybe tell me in the comments what book you think I should do next. But for now, let's finish up with the Psalms. Today, I want to talk about the Psalms as poetry. We know the Psalms are poetry, but how do we know that? And what does that mean? What does it look like? Well, to start, the Hebrew poetry that we find in the Bible is very different from modern poetry that we're used to. And I think it can help to look at how it's different. So, first of all, you might have already noticed, but the Psalms do not rhyme. I think one of the first things many of us English speaking Americans think when we think about poetry is that something rhymes, that poems are supposed to rhyme. And of course, not all poems rhyme, we know this, but many, many do. We have Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. We have Two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the one less traveled by. These are our English poems, and they often rhyme. But the Psalms don't rhyme at all. They don't rhyme in our English translations, but they also don't rhyme in the original Hebrew. Rhyming was not part of ancient Hebrew poetry like it is so much a part of English poetry. So that's one way that they're different. Also, the rhymes don't tend to have meter. In English poetry, again, not always, but in much of our poetry, we're used to it having a discernible rhythmic pattern. For example, we have Amazing Grace. We have Amazing Grace, 4 syllables. How sweet the sound, 4 more syllables. And then That saved a wretch like me, which is 6 syllables. So you've got this pattern of like 4, 4, and then 6. And then it repeats. I once was lost, 4, but now I'm found, another 4. Was blind, but now I see. You've got 6. So you've got that 4, 4, 6 pattern. But in the Psalms, we don't really have that. Some scholars have tried to find a pattern, but so far no one's really had much luck. And so I think it's safe to say the Psalms don't have rhythm or don't have meter in the same way we do, our poetry does. But there is one area of our poetry and the Psalms that does overlap, and that is that both tend to use a lot of imagery and metaphor. So poetry, both in English and Hebrew, tends to be less straightforward than prose. For example, Psalm 23 could just say, God takes care of us, God provides for us, but instead what it does say is, the Lord is my shepherd. It uses the metaphor of a shepherd to communicate something about God. Prose writing uses metaphor as well, but poetry tends to really rely more heavily on it. So that's one way you can recognize Hebrew poetry, is it's going to have a lot more imagery, just like in English poetry. That's one area where they do overlap. So there's one big thing that's important in Hebrew poetry, but there is another very important thing to pay attention to, and that is called parallelism. Now, parallelism is a little bit easier to show than it is to just kind of define and describe, but basically, Hebrew poetry tends to have lines of poetry where usually two, sometimes three or four, but usually two phrases within the line are somehow related to each other or parallel to each other. So, as Tremper Longman says here, the second phrase is related to the first. It carries the thought found in the first phrase in some way, forward in some way. So, I'll show you a couple of examples. This first example comes from Psalm 2, verse 1. The first phrase in this verse is, "Why do the nations conspire?" And then the second phrase almost says the exact same thing, but using slightly different words. So instead of nations, you have peoples, which are both referring to the foreign peoples and nations who lived around Israel. In the first part of this verse, the nations conspire, and in the second part, they plot. And then the second phrase seems to at first, the second phrase just seems to drive the point of the first phrase home. It seems to kind of reiterate it, but then it also pushes forward. It also gives you some new information, some new way of thinking about this first phrase. It doesn't stop with reiterating the first phrase, but it moves forward to give the reader some new information about the nations and the peoples that are plotting and conspiring. And that new information, you can see in the orange up here, is that their plotting and their conspiring is in vain. And so it almost says the same thing, but it also moves on. It carries things forward. Here's another example of parallelism. This is from Psalm 34, verse 10. And this is kind of a slightly different relationship between two phrases, but it's still another form of parallelism. So here, the verse gives you two opposite extremes, and they're both working together to make one point. So in the first part, the young lions lack. And the second part is, but those who seek the Lord do not lack. So these two phrases seem to be opposite, but they're functioning in the poem to communicate one idea, which is that God provides for God's people. Another example comes from Psalm 42, and here we start out with some abstract poetic imagery. As the deer pants for the water. And then the function of the second line is to take that abstract idea and solidify it, to take that metaphor and explain it and elaborate on it. So as the deer pants for the water, so my soul pants for you, O God. Another example. Let's see, hold on. So, as you read the Psalms, keep this idea of parallelism in your mind. I'd say in almost every verse, not every verse, but in almost every verse, you're going to find one or two phrases that the first phrase will lay out something about God or about life or whatever. And then the second phrase will take that first phrase and repeat it somehow, but also move it forward, also elaborate on it, tell you more about that first phrase. So that's what you need to look for in Hebrew poetry, and that's one of the most defining characteristics of what makes Hebrew poetry versus Hebrew prose. It will move the plot of the psalm forward, it will give you a different perspective, or it will explain something more about the first phrase. So understanding these parallelisms can be very helpful, not just for reading the Psalms, but for really reading the whole Bible, because you'll find poetry in unexpected places, and it will not all of it, but most of it will use this parallelism that will, once you get the hang of that form, you're going to be able to recognize a lot of poetry, and it's very helpful. So now I just want to throw out a few more things that you might see when you read the Psalms. And I just think these things are cool, so I'm just throwing them out there. First of all, some of the Psalms are acrostic psalms. An acrostic, if you remember from English class, I had to refresh my memory myself, but it's where if you take the first letter of each line or of each word, it spells out something. So in the Psalms, you have a few Psalms that are acrostic, and all of them spell out the Hebrew alphabet. So this is an example in Hebrew. I won't explain what every single one of these words mean, but if you'll look at the screen, the Hebrew reads from right to left. And so you see in that first word, you have on the right an aleph in the red there. And that is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And then next to it, you see that the first word, the first line of this verse starts with an aleph, also in the red. The second letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Beit, which you can see in the green. And the second word of the second line begins with Bet, and so on and so on. And it goes through almost the whole alphabet like that. So I just think that's neat. Another thing that I just think is neat is the Psalms have something, a lot of them have something called an inclusio. And again, none of the Psalms have all of these things. Every Psalm's going to be a little different. These are just some elements that might pop up as you read. So an inclusio, one of my professors called it a bookend, and I think that's easier to say, so I'm just going to call it a bookend from now on. But this is where the first verse of a psalm and the last verse of a psalm have some kind of connection or similarity. So Psalm 73 starts with, "Surely God is good to Israel." And then the last verse of Psalm 73 is, "It is good to be near God." So you have this theme of goodness that starts at the beginning and closes out the psalm. It kind of envelops this psalm. And if you want to know what the main theme of a psalm is, sometimes you can look for an inclusio or look for a bookend by looking at the first verse and looking at the last verse and seeing if there's any connection there. So I think that's neat. And then we have another thing. This one's a little more complicated, but it is my favorite. And it's really fun to look for these in the Psalms, and it's really satisfying when you find them. So I'll try to explain it the best I can. So this is called a chiasm. And the name comes from the Greek letter chi, which looks exactly like our English letter X. And so and you'll see why in just a minute. So just keep that in the back of your mind. A chiasm is kind of like the inclusio. It's kind of like the bookends that we just talked about. But if you took the bookends and then you put another set of bookends inside of them, and then you put another set of bookends inside of that until they met in the middle. So I'll try to explain this the best I can. So here we have Psalm 46. And the first verse and the last verse are an inclusio. They are bookends. They're both about God being our refuge. But then if you take those bookends and you put another set of bookends inside of them, you have the second verse and the second to the last verse also have similar themes. Verse 2, which is the second verse, tells readers, "Do not fear, though the earth should tremble." And then verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." They're both calling for this heavenly peace in the midst of earthly chaos. So you've got bookends, and then you've got another set of bookends inside of that, and then you have another set of bookends inside of that. So the third part of this psalm and the third to the last part of this psalm are also very similar. Verse 3 and 4 is a section about God's rule over nature. God has control over nature. And then verses 8 and 9, which are the third to the last section, are about God's rule over the nations and God's rule over the whole world of politics and kingdoms. And then, so you've got bookends within bookends within bookends, and it keeps going. You've got one more set of bookends in the verse 5, which is the fourth section. God talks about being with us. And in verse 7, which is the fourth to the last section, it also talks about God being with us. And so you've got another bookend. And then finally, these verses meet smack dab in the middle. At the beginning of verse 6, the nations are shouting and raging. And in the second half of verse 6, that's contrasted with God speaking and being able to control the earth with just a word. So these are kind of this contrasting ideas, and that's where this meets. So maybe you can kind of see why it's called a chiasm. You've got that X. Remember, chi is the Greek letter that looks like our letter X. And if you diagram this psalm, you see that it kind of takes on an X shape. You've got two mirror images that meet in the middle, just like an X. Now, this is all interesting and fun stuff, but if there is one thing that's important to know about poetry, it's that you shouldn't overthink it too much. So I'm going to close out today. I want to read you a poem by Billy Collins that I think demonstrates this idea. It's called Introduction to Poetry, and I'm going to read it for you. I asked them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into the poem and watch him probe his way out. Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. And I think Billy Collins wrote this about poetry in general, but I think it's also true of the Psalms. Sometimes we forget that the Psalms are poems, and we try so hard to figure out exactly what they mean, and we try so hard to find all these little structures and elements of the Psalms, and it's like we're tying the Psalm to a chair and beating it with a hose. We're tying it to a chair and trying to torture a confession out of it. And it might be fun to look for chiasms. It might be fun to look at parallelisms. And I think that stuff is important, which is why I told you about it. I didn't tell you about it for no reason. I love this kind of stuff, but I'm a nerd. But while we learn about the Psalms, while we learn about Hebrew poetry structure, let us never forget that these psalms are poems. These psalms are supposed to be sung to God as prayers from the heart. And we might get so caught up in trying to figure out exactly what they mean, exactly what their structure is, that we forget to let the imagery of the psalms spur our imagination and teach us something new about ourselves, about our world, and about our God. So I hope that I have presented some helpful tools during this Bible study, but I also hope that you won't forget to do what Collins talks about. Hold the Psalms up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. Walk inside the Psalms room and feel the walls for a light switch. Water ski across the surface of the Psalm. In other words, explore the Psalms. Figure out not exactly what they mean, but how do they make you feel? What beautiful things do you see in them? What new things do you learn about yourself and about God through them? And that's what I want for you. I don't want you to know everything about the Psalms. I've thrown a lot of information at you these last 2 or 3 weeks, and you're not going to remember all of it because I don't even remember all of it. But that's okay. I just want you to be a little more comfortable exploring the Psalms and seeing what you can learn about yourself and about God from them. So I hope this Bible study is useful. I hope our practice of reading a psalm to God every day has been useful. And if it has been, well, no one says you have to quit just because our Bible study is over. So I hope that if this has been helpful to you, that you will keep using the Psalms to learn to pray. They are truly an inexhaustible resource that you could explore for the rest of your life and still not figure out everything there is to know about these amazing songs, because these are songs about our amazing, inexhaustible God. So, have a great Christmas, and I will see you soon.